At 0408 on the 1st of March, I was standing at the northeast corner of a generator shed on the Arctic coast, binoculars raised, when the wind stopped and I heard footsteps begin in empty air 500 feet away. Through an infrared illuminator I had built from parts in the equipment shed 2 days earlier, I watched boot prints press into hard-packed snow one after another, left, right, 28-inch stride, heading west. There was no figure, no shadow, nothing between the stars and the ground, just compressions forming in sequence under real weight, at walking speed, each one making the specific crunch of a boot on cold snow that I have heard 10,000 times in my life, and that my body recognizes the way it recognizes a door closing or a car starting. The temperature on my handheld unit dropped 1.7 degrees in 9 seconds. The anemometer on the weather mast, which I could see from where I stood, went still. And across 500 feet of frozen coastal plain, and the kind of silence that only exists when every moving thing in the landscape has stopped at once, something that was not there walked past me at 2.8 miles per hour like a man on his way to work. I'm a facilities and systems operator. I measure things. I had measured this 5 times already. But you can measure a thing 5 times on paper and still not be ready to stand in the dark and listen to it happen with your own ears. To explain how I ended up at the corner of that shed with homemade infrared optics at 4 in the morning, I need to go back about 5 weeks. My name is Craig Deloitte. For 11 years, I've worked as a facilities and systems operator at remote installations, which is a generous way of saying I keep generators running, pipes from freezing, and buildings alive in places that are actively trying to kill the buildings every single day. 2 postings in northern Canada, 1 on Svalbard, 1 in Alaska. The company that hired me for Covach Point is called Meridian Polar Services. They're a contractor that staffs and maintains private research stations for universities, mining survey outfits, and occasionally government projects that don't want to run their own logistics. The pay is good because nobody wants to do it. I signed the Covach Point contract in October. The station sits on the northern Alaska coast, east of Prudhoe Bay by about 90 miles, on a gravel pad maybe 200 yards from the Beaufort Sea. In winter, you can't tell where the land ends and the sea ice begins. 3 connected prefab modules on steel pilings driven into permafrost. Generator shed, main living and operations unit, and a smaller storage bay. Fuel tank farm, satellite communications array, weather station mast. The nearest permanent settlement is Dead Horse, a 2-hour snow machine ride in good conditions. Not a town, a work camp. Covach Point was my 5th remote posting, and by the time I signed the contract I'd learned that each one has a personality you don't find in the briefing documents. My rotation on Svalbard had been defined by the sound of glacial calving in the distance. A low percussion that came through the floor of the station at unpredictable intervals and made you feel like the island was clearing its throat. The first posting in northern Canada, a mining survey camp near Great Bear Lake, had been defined by silence so total that after 3 weeks I started talking to myself just to confirm my hearing still worked. My supervisor on that job, a Norwegian named Elstad, had told me something I carried to every posting after. The building will tell you what it needs if you learn to read the data. The landscape won't tell you anything. You have to take what you can measure and accept that the rest is not yours to know. I thought I understood what he meant. I didn't, not fully, not until Covach Point. But his habit of trusting instruments over intuition is one I adopted, and it's the reason I kept the kind of records I kept. I flew in January 26th by charter helicopter from Dead Horse. The pilot was a woman named Rena who had flown the North Slope for 15 years and had the kind of calm that comes from having already survived whatever you're worried about. She helped me unload my personal gear and 4 cases of supplies while the rotors were still turning. The air hit my throat like swallowing a sheet of aluminum. -23 and dead calm, which is rare up there. rare enough that the silence had a physical quality, a high-frequency pressure against the eardrums, as if the air itself carried a static charge it couldn't discharge. Rena looked at the station and said, "Furnace is running." That's a good sign. I asked her what a bad sign would be. Furnace not running. She gave me a wave and lifted off, and that was the last human being I saw in person for 38 days. The station had been unoccupied for about 6 weeks. The previous operator, a man named Tomaszewski, had finished his rotation in mid-December, and Meridian had left the station on automated systems during the gap. My job was to bring everything back to full manual operation, verify all systems, and prepare for a university glaciology team scheduled to arrive from Fairbanks in late March. They needed the station warm, powered, and the equipment bays configured for their gear. That first week I ran diagnostics on both generators, led the heating system, tested the satellite uplink and inventoried supplies. I replaced a coupling on the water system that had started to seep and walked the exterior of all 3 modules, checking for ice damage. Standard turnover. Every morning at 0800, I reported to Meridian's dispatch office in Anchorage on the satellite phone. The conversations lasted 90 seconds. Systems nominal. Fuel at X%, weather is Y, I need nothing. Copy confirmed, next check-in. The temperature that first week ranged from -18 to -29. Wind mostly from the northeast, 10 to 25 knots, with one day gusting above 40 that I spent entirely indoors listening to the panels creak and the generator shed rattle on its pilings. At that latitude in late January, you get maybe an hour and a half of civil twilight, a blue-gray brightening along the southern horizon that never fully commits, and then it's dark again. By my second week, the light was noticeably longer, but the sun itself didn't clear the horizon until February 4th, and even then it was a sliver, orange and flat, sitting on the ice for 20 minutes before dropping back. For those 20 minutes, the whole coastal plain turned colors I don't have names for. Amber underneath, violet above, and the snow caught both and held them like a bruise healing in reverse. I stood outside and watched it with a mug of coffee freezing in my hand and thought, this is why I do this work. The cold bit into the knuckles of my gloveless hand and the coffee developed a skin of ice I had to crack with my lip, and the light kept deepening until it looked like something that should make a sound, a low hum at the frequency of color itself. Then I went back inside and found the file. It was in the operations desk drawer, which I'd opened looking for a replacement fuse. A manila folder, unlabeled, with maybe 30 pages inside. Handwritten log entries, not on official Meridian forms but on lined notebook paper, the kind you'd tear from a composition book. The handwriting was small, precise, European-looking. Tomaszewski. The first entry was dated November 22nd. It read, in its entirety, 0740. Boot prints NE of station approximately 400 feet. One set, heading west, no origin visible. Stride 28 inches. Logged with Anchorage, incident file 2387-KP. There were 19 more entries after that, running through December 12th, 2 days before Tomaszewski left. Each one documented a set of boot prints. Each one noted the same stride length, 28 inches. Each one noted the same bearing, west, and each one noted the distance from the station to the origin point, and those numbers decreased. 400 feet, 393, 386, each appearance roughly 7 feet closer. He'd been tracking the same thing I hadn't seen yet, and Meridian had given him an incident file number. My hands smelled like diesel from the generator work I'd been doing that morning. The paper smelled like cold, that flat mineral scent that permeates everything at those temperatures. Between the diesel on my fingers and the cold in the paper, The words on those pages felt like they belonged to a different category of real than the station around me. I read them twice. Then I called Meridian. Anchorage, this is Kovach Point, Deloitte. Go ahead, Kovach. I found handwritten logs from the previous operator, Tomaszewski. He documented boot prints appearing near the station over a period of approximately 3 weeks. Heading west, no origin point. He references an incident file 2387-KP. I need you to brief me on what he observed and what your assessment was. The pause lasted long enough for me to hear the satellite link hiss. Copy, Kovach. Stand by. 4 minutes later, a different voice came on. A man named Hall, and from his tone I understood he'd been waiting for this call the way you wait for a dentist appointment. Deloitte, this is Hall, Operations Oversight. The Tomaszewski observations are in our file. We assessed them as anomalous but non-threatening, likely related to prior site activity or environmental patterning. We didn't brief you because the phenomenon was inactive at the time of your contract signing and we had no evidence it would recur. Environmental patterning. That's the assessment on file. Hall, he logged 20 appearances in 21 days, each one closer to the station. That's not environmental patterning, that's approach. Another pause. Continue your operational duties. If you observe similar activity, log it with GPS coordinates, distance from station, and precise timestamps. Report any observations through the morning check-in. You want me to collect data for you. We want you to maintain the station and report anything unusual. That's in your contract. He wasn't wrong about the contract. I let it go. But something had shifted, not in the station, but in my understanding of what I'd signed up for. Meridian had sent me to a posting where the previous operator had documented 20 instances of something impossible, and they'd filed it and said nothing. That's not unusual for companies. It's how they work. But knowing it and standing in the middle of it are different experiences. On February 9th, I went outside at approximately 10:30 to check the weather station mast. The anemometer had been reading 0 for 6 hours, which was wrong. There's always wind at Kovach Point. Even on the calmest day I experienced there, the sensor registered at least 3 or 4 knots. A sustained 0 meant ice in the bearings or a wiring fault. The twilight was at its brightest, that deep blue hour when the southern horizon glows but the sun stays hidden. -22, clear, visibility as good as it gets. I fixed the sensor with a heat gun from my parka pocket, ice in the bearing cups, and the freed mechanism made a thin metallic whir as the vanes caught the wind. I watched the anemometer settle at 8 knots from the northeast, which matched what I could feel cutting across my exposed cheekbones. Then I turned around to walk back to the main module and saw them. Boot prints, 500 feet north of the station. Human footprints in hard-packed snow, clear and sharp-edged, maybe size 10 or 11. Running in a straight line, roughly east to west, perpendicular to the station. My brain processed the sight in layers. First, the recognition. Prints in snow. Something I've read 1,000 times hunting whitetail in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Then the context, Tomaszewski's logs, the 20 entries, the 7-foot convergence. Then the wrongness. The prints started from nothing. Before the first one, undisturbed snow in every direction, the surface smooth and wind-scoured and carrying the faint ammoniac smell of old ice that means nothing has changed here in a long time. A boot had pressed into the snow at that point, and there was no history before it. I didn't panic. What I did was pull the tape measure from my cargo pocket, walk to the prints, and measure the stride length between the first and second impressions. 28 inches, the same number Tomaszewski had written in his logs, starting 11 weeks earlier. Whatever was making these prints had been doing it before I arrived, had continued through the 6-week gap when the station was empty, and was now doing it for me. I followed the prints west. They had a consistent depth, a slight toe out on the left foot, and they moved at what I estimated was a normal walking pace. Not hurrying, not wandering. After about a quarter mile, the light began to fail and I turned back. The prints didn't deviate, didn't stop, didn't change. A straight line heading west toward nothing. Open tundra, eventually the Colville River Delta, then more tundra. No roads, no structures, no camps within 50 miles in that direction. Back inside, I logged the observation with GPS coordinates for the origin point, the bearing, the stride, and the approximate number of prints visible. I uploaded it with my morning report. Meridian's reply came that afternoon. Received, consistent with prior observations. Continue monitoring per Hull's instructions. Consistent with prior observations. They'd dropped the pretense of environmental patterning. The file was open, and I was the current data point. 3 days later, I pulled up the station's automated fuel consumption logs from the 6-week gap between Tomaszewski's departure and my arrival. The station had been running on automated systems, generators cycling to maintain minimum heat and keep the pipes from freezing. Fuel consumption during that period should have been predictable. I'd done this calculation at other postings. You take the exterior temperature data, apply the thermal loss coefficient of the building, factor the generator efficiency, and you get a number. The number I got was 63 gallons higher than what was actually consumed. The station had used less fuel than the math required. Not by a lot, not by a dramatic amount, but by enough that if I ran the calculation 5 times, I got 5 answers that were all too high. The building had stayed warmer than diesel alone could explain. I sat with that for a while. The overhead light in the operations module buzzed at a frequency I'd learned to ignore during my first week, but which now seemed to vibrate in the fillings of my back teeth. Through the double-paned window, the snowfield was blue-white and featureless. Somewhere out there, 500 feet to the north and closing, boot prints were waiting to happen again. On February 14th, I found the second set. Same characteristics. Boot prints, consistent stride, slight toe out on the left. Starting from nothing, approximately 494 feet from the station. 6 feet closer than the first. Heading west. This time I followed them to their end. I brought a GPS unit and walked the track for 1.3 miles across flat coastal plain. The smell of the snow changed as I moved away from the station, losing the faint diesel tinge that clings to everything within a few hundred yards of the generator exhaust and becoming something cleaner, sharper, the blank mineral cold of ice that has never been near a human structure. The prints maintained their heading, their spacing, and their depth the entire way. Then they stopped. The last print was a left foot, mid-stride, and after it there was nothing. As if the walker had ceased to exist between one step and the next. No arrival point, no departure point. A segment of walking, 1.3 miles long, pasted into the landscape and then cut out again. The wind was picking up from the north. I stood at that last print and looked west, toward the horizon where the fading blue light met flat white ice, and felt something I want to describe accurately. Not fear, a misalignment. The sensation you get when you step onto what you think is a solid surface and it gives slightly, and for a fraction of a second your body doesn't know what's true. That fraction of a second, stretched across an empty snowfield, standing at the last footprint of a person who doesn't exist. Back at the station, I ate dinner standing at the counter because I didn't want to sit down. Canned beef stew heated on the propane burner, the smell of it filling the module, salty and metallic and too familiar. I'd eaten this meal at 4 different postings across 11 years. The ritual of it, spoon scraping the bottom of the pot, was the most real thing in my day. While I ate, I compared my GPS data with Tomaszewski's handwritten coordinates. His prints had originated from approximately 400 feet and closed to 355 by his last entry on December 12th. Mine had started at 500, further out. That didn't fit a simple linear model. Either the phenomenon had reset during the 6-week gap, or the origin distance wasn't converging on the station in a straight arithmetic progression. I graphed both datasets on a piece of notebook paper. Tomaszewski's showed a convergence rate of roughly 7 feet per appearance. Mine, with only 2 data points, was too early to determine. But his line, if extended, would have reached the station around February 20th. And then the gap had happened, and it seemed to have pushed back out. Like resetting a clock. Like starting over with a new operator. I put the notebook away and washed my pot, and didn't think about what that implied about the relationship between the phenomenon and the person in the station. On February 19th, the third set appeared. 487 feet from the station. I measured at 3 points, confirmed the 28-inch stride, and flagged the origin with a piece of orange surveyor's tape tied to a bamboo garden stake from the equipment shed. Then I went back inside and did something I should have done earlier. The station has 4 weatherproof cameras mounted at the corners of the main module, aimed outward, recording continuously to a hard drive in the operations room. Low resolution, black and white, primarily for security and ice monitoring. I reviewed the previous 48 hours on all 4 feeds. At 03:47 on February 18th, the north-facing camera showed the footprints appearing. The camera captures 1 image every 2 seconds. At 03:47:12, the snowfield is empty. At 03:47:14, the first 3 prints are visible. At 03:47:16, 2 more. At 03:47:18, 2 more. The prints appear in sequence, at walking speed, left, right, moving east to west across the frame. There is no figure, no shadow, no disturbance in the snow other than the prints themselves forming in the surface, each compression precise and deliberate, as if a body with weight and intent were stepping forward through empty air. The whole sequence crossed the camera's field of view in about 40 seconds. Then the snow was still. I went back and watched it 4 more times. Slowed it, zoomed the playback, adjusted the contrast. Nothing was there. The prints were being made by nothing. Weight without a body, stride without legs. A walk without a walker. I saved the footage to a separate hard drive. Then I cross-referenced the camera timestamp with the weather station data log. At 03:47, the automated temperature sensor recorded a drop of 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit in 11 seconds, from -26.3 to -27.7. The anemometer registered a brief drop to 0 for 8 seconds, then returned to its baseline of 6 knots. The barometric pressure didn't change. Just the temperature and the wind, dipping simultaneously for exactly the duration of the footprint sequence, as if something had passed through the sensor's airspace and displaced the thermal baseline. I went back through the weather data for February 9th and February 14th, the dates of the first and second sets. Both showed the same signature. A brief temperature depression and an anemometer drop to 0, each lasting 30 to 50 seconds. I hadn't noticed because the fluctuations were within normal Arctic variance. You'd only see the pattern if you were looking for it. Tomaszewski might have noticed. His logs didn't mention weather data, but his logs were on notebook paper, not official forms. Maybe he had a separate file. Maybe Meridian had it. I called Anchorage, and for the first time I didn't keep my voice level. "I have camera footage," I said. "The prints are forming in real time. There's no one making them. I also have a correlated weather signature, temperature drop, and wind cessation coinciding with each appearance. I need you to send someone out here or I need extraction." They put me on hold for 11 minutes. When they came back, it was a woman's voice I hadn't heard before. She didn't give her name. "Mr. Deloitte, We've reviewed your reports and the imagery you've uploaded. We'd like you to continue monitoring and logging. We can have a crew out to you within 72 hours for a site assessment, but we do not classify this as an extraction-level event at this time. You don't classify invisible footprints with a correlated atmospheric signature as extraction level. We classify it as a phenomenon that has been observed at high-latitude coastal stations and does not pose a direct threat to personnel or infrastructure. The crew will assess. In the meantime, continue logging the interval, the bearing, the coordinates, and now the weather data. That correlation is new. She said it the way you'd say a lab result is interesting. Not alarmed, interested. What about Tomaszewski? I said. Did he report a weather signature? A pause. Mr. Tomaszewski's reports are in the file. I'm not authorized to discuss another operator's documentation with you. He wrote his observations on notebook paper and left them in a desk drawer for me to find. That's not official documentation. That's one person leaving a warning for the next. Maintain your reporting schedule, Mr. Deloitte. The crew will be there within 72 hours. She disconnected. The crew never came, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On February 22nd, between the third and fourth appearances, I found something else. I was in the storage module running inventory on the equipment the glaciology team would need, and in a case of survey stakes I found a handheld GPS unit that wasn't mine. It was an older Garmin model, scratched and well used, and when I powered it on and checked the saved waypoints, there were 47 of them, each one labeled with a date and a letter. November 22nd-0 through December 12th-0, and then December 12th-T. The O waypoints, when I plotted them on the map display, formed a line. 40 points arranged in a rough arc around the station, each one progressively closer. These were Tomaszewski's origin points, the spots where each set of prints began. He'd been logging them on this GPS more precisely than in his handwritten notes. The T waypoints were different. 7 of them, scattered along a line extending west from the station, each one 1.3 miles from its corresponding origin point. Tomaszewski had followed the prints to their end. 7 times he'd walked out to the termination point and marked it. All 7 termination points were within 12 feet of each other. Not identical, but clustered, as if the prints, regardless of where they started around the station, always ended at approximately the same spot, 1.3 miles to the west. A fixed destination. Not random, not determined by the origin, but targeted. Every walk, from every starting point, ended in the same place. I sat in the cold storage module with the GPS in my lap, and the overhead bulb casting a yellow circle on the floor, and thought about what that meant. The station was the anchor. The termination point was the destination. The prints walked from one to the other, each time starting a little closer, and the end point never changed. Something was walking from near me to a specific place, over and over, and whatever was at that place 1.3 miles west was the fixed variable, not the station. The station was just where the approach began. The fourth set appeared on February 24th, right on schedule 5 days after the third. Origin, 480 feet from the station. Bearing west. Stride, 28 inches. I measured, photographed, flagged, and logged everything, including the weather station data. Temperature drop of 1.6 degrees over 9 seconds at OH 412. Anemometer 0 for 12 seconds. The signature was getting slightly more pronounced each time. That evening I did the convergence math. All 4 origin distances plotted against time. My data now showed a convergence rate of approximately 7 feet per appearance, the same rate as Tomaszewski's. At 7 feet per 5-day interval, starting from 480, the origin point would reach the station in approximately 343 days. Almost a year, a long time. But Tomaszewski's data said it had already been converging for 3 weeks before I arrived, had reached 355 feet, and then the gap had reset it to 500. So the convergence continued regardless of whether anyone was in the station. It just went back to a further starting point when a new operator arrived, as if it had to start the approach over, as if the distance was specific to the person inside. I called my sister that night on the satellite phone. Sarah lives in Marquette, works the night shift at the hospital, and she's the only person in my life who consistently answers when I call. The connection was clean. 22,000 miles of signal bouncing off a satellite and arriving in the UP with just enough delay to make the conversation feel like it was happening through deep water. "You sound weird," she said, about 2 minutes in. "Tired? You're always tired up there. This is different. You sound like you're choosing your words." She knows me. That's the problem with people who know you. They hear the shape of what you're not saying. "I found some strange stuff out here, probably nothing. The company's looking into it." Strange, like dangerous, or strange like interesting? Both, I thought. Neither. Strange like the ground rules of the physical world have a footnote I've never read. "Interesting," I said. "Tell me about work." She told me about a kid who'd come into the ER with a Lego stuck so far up his nose they'd needed an ENT consult. She told me her neighbor's dog had learned to open the gate and kept showing up on her porch. She told me it was snowing in Marquette, which in February is not news, and that she'd made pasties from Mom's recipe and they'd turned out wrong in a way she couldn't identify. "Send me the recipe," I said. "I'll tell you what you did wrong. You can't even make chili without a can." "From several cans. It's an art," she laughed. The sound traveled through space and arrived in a metal building on the edge of the Arctic Ocean, and for 30 seconds the footprints didn't exist. The fuel math balanced. The snow outside was just snow, inert and honest, and exactly as cold as the thermometer said it was. "Call me more often," she said before we hung up. "I will." The next morning, February 25th, I pulled up the station's heating system logs. Not the fuel consumption records, which I'd already checked, but the actual thermal cycling data, the record of when the heating elements activated and deactivated to maintain the target temperature. The system was simple. Thermostat reads interior temp, compares it to the set point of 58 degrees, turns the heat on if it's below, off if it's at or above. The logs showed something I hadn't expected. On the dates of each footprint appearance, the heating system had cycled off for periods ranging from 6 to 19 minutes. Not because the temperature had reached 58, but because the temperature had risen above 58, to as high as 61.2 degrees, without the heating system running. The interior of the station had warmed by 3 degrees on its own, in the middle of the Arctic winter, at the exact time invisible boots were pressing into the snow outside. The thermal gain coincided, within minutes, with the weather station's external temperature drop. When the temperature outside dipped 1.4 degrees during a footprint event, the temperature inside rose by a proportional amount, as if heat were being moved, not generated, transferred. This was the fuel anomaly from a different angle. The fuel consumption logs for Kovach Point Station between February 9th and March 3rd would eventually show that I burned 1,140 gallons of diesel running the generator. That number was accurate. I kept good records. What couldn't be accurate, what the math would never reconcile, was that during those same 22 days the station's heating system maintained an interior temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit, while the exterior temperature averaged minus 31. The fuel math worked for one of those numbers. It could not work for both. Either I burned significantly less fuel than I logged, or the building stayed warm on something other than diesel. The diesel was only responsible for part of the warmth. The rest came from somewhere outside the system I was operating. I sat at the operations desk with the heating logs printed out in front of me and the overhead light buzzing and the coffee in my mug cooling and thought, something walks past the station every 5 days, invisible, displacing temperature from outside to inside, approaching 7 feet closer each time, always heading for the same point 1.3 miles to the west, and the company that sent me here has a file on it, and the man before me tried to warn me with a folder in a desk drawer. The fifth set appeared on March 1st, right on schedule. This time I was outside. I'd set an alarm for 03:30 and stood at the corner of the generator shed in full cold weather gear, binoculars in hand, the air at -27 stinging the strip of skin between my balaclava and my goggles. A 6-knot wind from the north. Stars so thick the sky looked granular, each one a hard white point in a blackness that went up forever. Dawn was still 3 hours away. At 04:08 the wind stopped, not eased. Stopped. The silence hit like a pressure change. My ears adjusted to the absence of the one sound that never ceased at Kovach Point, and in the new quiet I heard it. A soft compression, then another, then another. Footsteps in packed snow 500 feet away in the dark, and I raised the binoculars and turned on the infrared illuminator I'd mounted on them 2 days earlier with parts from the equipment shed. The snowfield appeared in green-gray monochrome through the optics, and I saw them. Boot prints pressing into the snow from above, one after another, left, right, 28-inch stride, heading west. No figure. Nothing between the sky and the ground. Just depressions forming in sequence, the snow compressing under real weight, and a faint creak of ice crystals that I could hear even at this distance in the absolute windless silence. Each print made a sound like someone stepping off a porch into fresh snow. That particular crunch, I've heard it 10,000 times in my life. My body knows that sound the way it knows a door closing or a car starting. It is the sound of a person walking, and there was no person. Origin point, 473 feet from the station. I measured later that morning. I timed the sequence. The prints crossed my visible field in just over 4 minutes. Walking speed of roughly 2.8 miles per hour. Measured, steady, calm. Like a person walking to work, like a commute. When the last audible compression faded to the west, the wind came back. 6 knots, northeast, as if someone had pressed on pause. The temperature, which I checked on my handheld unit, had dropped 1.7 degrees during the event and was now climbing back. I lowered the binoculars and my hands were shaking. Not from the cold. I've been cold for 11 years. My hands were shaking because I had just watched a physical law demonstrate that it has a setting I've never been shown, and it demonstrated this calmly, on schedule, at 28-inch intervals, while I stood there with my binoculars and my infrared light and my tape measure like a man trying to take the dimensions of something that doesn't fit in dimensions. Later that morning, still running on adrenaline and a pot of coffee strong enough to dissolve the spoon, I did something I'd been putting off. I loaded the 47 waypoints from Tomaszewski's GPS into the station's mapping software along with my own waypoint data and generated a composite plot. The image stopped me. Tomaszewski's origin points formed a spiral. Not random scatter, not a straight convergence line, but a logarithmic spiral tightening around the station from the northeast, the same general quadrant all my origin points had appeared in. My 5 data points continued the spiral's trajectory. Together, the 2 datasets described approximately 2/3 of a complete revolution around the station, each point closer than the last, curving inward like water circling a drain, and every single termination point, his and mine, clustered within that same 12-foot radius, 1.3 miles to the west. 47 approaches from 47 different angles, all arriving at the same destination. The station was the origin, The destination was fixed, and the path between them was tightening. I printed the plot and pinned it to the wall above the operations desk. The spiral looked organic, governed by a ratio I recognized from engineering references but had never expected to see drawn in boot prints across a snowfield. I measured the angular progression between consecutive origin points and found it was consistent to within 2 degrees. Whatever was walking was not choosing its starting position randomly. It was following a mathematical curve as precisely as if it were running on a track. I uploaded the composite data to Meridian that afternoon with a written summary of the spiral geometry and the angular consistency. The acknowledgement came back within an hour, which was faster than any of my previous reports had been answered. Received, data forwarded to assessment team. Maintain monitoring schedule. No comment on the spiral, no questions. Just received and forwarded, as if I'd sent a weather update. The crew from Meridian never came. On March 2nd, I called Anchorage and asked about the 72-hour assessment team the unnamed woman had promised. Hull answered. He said the crew had been delayed by logistics and rescheduled for the following week. His voice had the careful flatness of a man reading from a script he didn't write. I want extraction, I said. I'll relay the request. Hull. I've been here 35 days. The phenomenon has appeared 5 times on my watch. It correlates with thermal displacement and atmospheric disruption, and the origin points are converging in a logarithmic spiral. Tomaszewski documented 20 appearances before me. The company has a file. I am not the first person to request extraction from this station, and I'd like to know what happened when the last person asked. Silence on the line. Then Tomaszewski completed his rotation. Did he complete it, or did he leave early? A helicopter will be available March 5th, weather permitting. That's not an answer. That's the available answer, Deloitte. Pack for the 5th. On the night of March 3rd, I couldn't sleep. The sleep problems had started around the 3rd appearance. Not insomnia exactly, but a persistent alertness. A difficulty releasing the day. The station's nighttime sounds were familiar to me by then. Generator hum, heating system tick, the occasional rifle shot crack of a panel contracting in the cold, wind testing the seams of the window frames. A catalog I could recite in my sleep, except I wasn't sleeping. At approximately 02:15, I heard a sound that wasn't in the catalog. Soft, rhythmic. Muffled by the walls and insulation but immediately recognizable because I had stood outside 2 days earlier and listened to it from 473 feet. Footsteps. Outside the building. Close. The interval was wrong. Only 2 days since the last appearance, not 5. Either the schedule had accelerated, or this was something different, or the 5-day cycle was only the part of the pattern I could see from the ground, the visible fraction of something far more frequent. I pulled on insulated pants and boots without lacing them and went to the operations room. Camera feeds running on the monitor. North, east, south, west. The south camera showed footprints forming along the length of the building, 3 feet from the wall, walking west to east. As I watched, a new print appeared at the edge of the frame, then another, steady, measured, right against the station. I looked at the heating system readout. Interior temperature was 61.8 degrees and climbing. The thermostat wasn't calling for heat, the heating elements were off, and the room was getting warmer. The footsteps stopped moving along the wall. For a moment there was silence, then a single compression sound, directly against the south wall of the operations room. Then another. The orientation had changed. The prints were no longer walking past the building, they were facing it. Standing in place, weight shifting foot to foot, the way a person stands when they've arrived where they're going. Something was standing 3 feet from the wall I was leaning against, invisible, with weight and presence and a 28-inch stride, and I could hear its weight shifting on the snow, and the room I was standing in was getting warmer by the second. I didn't move. My hand was on the desk. I listened. For 12 minutes, the compression sounds continued. Patient, unhurried, shifting weight. Right there. The wall between us was 4 inches of insulated panel on a steel frame, and I put my palm flat against it, and the surface was warm. Not cold. Warm. As if something on the other side were radiating heat through the steel and the insulation and the interior paneling, something that had taken the thermal energy from the outside air and was pressing it into my building in a slow, deliberate transfer. The interior temperature reached 63.1 degrees. Outside, the weather station recorded -34, the coldest reading of my entire posting. 6 degrees colder than the seasonal baseline. Heat was moving from out there to in here, and the thing that was moving it was standing against my wall. Then the footsteps moved. Back to the walking rhythm. Away from the building to the east, each compression a little fainter, receding across the snow until I couldn't hear them anymore. The temperature began to equalize. 62, 61. The heating system kicked in as the station cooled back to normal. Outside, the weather station showed the exterior temperature climbing back toward its baseline. The cameras showed a clear line of prints along the south wall and a pair facing the building, toes toward the paneling, side by side. Someone had stood there for 12 minutes looking at my wall, and the air on both sides of that wall had changed because of it. I did not go outside to examine them. I sat in the operations room with every interior light on and the taste of adrenaline at the back of my tongue, copper and dry, and waited for dawn. The waiting was the worst part, and also the most clarifying. In 5 hours of sitting at that desk with the camera feed cycling on the monitor and the heating system ticking through its recovery, I had time to think about the composite plot pinned to the wall above me, the spiral, the fixed termination point, the walking speed of 2.8 miles per hour, the fact that whatever had just stood at my wall had not tried to enter, had not knocked, had not tested the door, had paused, shifted its weight the way you shift your weight when you're standing at a crosswalk waiting for the light to change, and then continued on its way, the way you continue on your way. Every set of prints I'd tracked, every set Tomaszewski had tracked, headed west and terminated 1.3 miles from the station. The station wasn't the end of the route. The station was a landmark along it. Something was walking from somewhere east of here to somewhere 1.3 miles west, and the spiral convergence wasn't about reaching the building. The building was in the way. The convergence was the path adjusting, tightening, routing closer and closer to an obstacle it had to pass, like a trail worn deeper each season, like water finding the most efficient path around a stone and cutting the bank a little closer each time. I looked at the pair of prints on the south camera feed, toes toward my wall, and thought it stopped because the building was in its path. Not because of me. It stood there the way you'd stand at a fence that crosses a trail you've walked for years, waiting, patient, and then it went around. We are not the destination. We are on the way. That thought didn't arrive in words. Not then, not at 2:15, in a building that smelled like diesel and old coffee with the Arctic pressing against every exterior surface. It arrived as a sensation, a recalibration, the feeling of a picture rotating 90 degrees and every shape in it becoming something else. What I'd been measuring as approach was transit. What I'd been reading as interest was inconvenience. The most disturbing thing that had happened to me at Kovach Point was not that something invisible had stood at my wall. It was that it had stood there and left, and I was not the reason for either. When the twilight came, I went outside. The prints along the south wall were sharp in the blue half-light, each one precise and deep. The pair facing the wall so close to the paneling that the toes of the impressions almost touched the foundation. I knelt beside them and smelled the cold mineral scent of compressed snow and felt the residual warmth still bleeding from the wall panel above them. I put my hand in the print, not to measure it, but because I wanted to know what it felt like. The impression was firm, well-defined, the kind of print a heavy person makes in settled snow. My hand fit inside it with room to spare. Size 11, maybe 12. The snow at the bottom of the print was fractionally warmer than the surrounding surface, or I imagined it was. I stood up and looked west, along the bearing every set of prints had followed, into the flat white expanse that stretched to the horizon, and beyond it to the Colville River Delta, and beyond that to more tundra, more ice, more of the same white page that something had been writing on in 28-inch intervals for longer than I'd been alive, maybe for longer than the station had existed, and 1.3 miles out there, in a 12-foot circle I had never visited and would never visit, every walk ended. Every single one. Then I went back inside and packed. Everything I'd brought, personal gear, the backup hard drive with camera footage, my written logs, GPS data, Tomaszewski's folder, and his handheld GPS with the 47 waypoints. I did a full station shutdown sequence because I am a professional and that is what you do, regardless of what has been standing outside your wall in the dark. Secured the fuel system. Set generators to automated standby. Locked equipment bays. Buttoned up modules. 4 hours of methodical work performed by a man whose hands were steady because the work required it. The helicopter came at 13:40 on March 5th. Rena again. She helped me load my gear without questions, and I appreciated the professionalism. As we lifted off and the station fell away below us, I looked down. The snowfield was covered in footprints, not one set, not 5, not the 25 combined sets from Tomaszewski's and my observations. Dozens, scores, maybe hundreds. Radiating outward from the station in every direction, lines of prints extending to the limit of visibility across the white coastal plain, like spokes of a wheel with the station at the hub. Some heading west, the bearing I'd been tracking. Others heading north, east, south, every compass point. The spiral pattern I'd mapped with the GPS data was there, visible from altitude as a tightening helix of tracks curving in from the northeast, but it was only one pattern among many. There were straight lines, arcs, clusters, and threads of prints extending so far across the ice that they faded into the haze at the horizon. From the ground, standing at one corner of one building, looking at one set of prints at a time, I'd been reading a single sentence from a document that was thousands of pages long. From 500 feet of altitude, the scale of it was apparent. The station sat in the center of a pattern so large and so dense that the snow around it looked like a page of text written in a language made entirely of boot prints. And every line, every track, every set of prints in that vast radiating pattern terminated 1.3 miles from the station in the same direction. West, the same 12-foot cluster. Hundreds of walks from hundreds of angles across what might have been months or years, all ending at the same point on the empty tundra. Rena looked down. Then she looked at me. The hell is all that? Foot traffic, I said. From what? I don't know. She turned back to the controls and didn't ask anything else. Below us, the station shrank and the pattern spread, and I watched it until the ice and the prints and the whole white expanse became abstract, just shapes on a surface, and then we were over open water, and there was nothing below us to read. I debriefed with Meridian in Anchorage 3 days later. A conference room in a low office building near the airport, fluorescent lights and a table that smelled of laminate cleaner. Just me and 2 people I hadn't met, a logistics manager named Aronson and a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patel. No title beyond the doctorate, no affiliation given. They had my reports printed in a stack. They had the camera footage on a laptop. They asked me to walk through the entire timeline, which I did, starting from the moment I found Tomaszewski's folder. Aronson took notes. Dr. Patel didn't write anything down. She listened with the particular attentiveness of someone comparing what they're hearing to something they already know. When I finished, she asked me one question. The termination point. The cluster, 1.3 miles west of the station. Did you go there? No. Why not? Because I was documenting what was walking toward it, not what was there. She nodded, and I couldn't tell whether I'd given the right answer or the wrong one. Aronson slid a document across the table. Revised contract termination agreement with a payout 40% higher than what I was owed for the rotation. We appreciate your thorough documentation, he said. What is it? I asked. Meaning the footprints, meaning the thermal transfer, meaning all of it. Dr. Patel looked at me over her glasses. We don't have an answer to that question, Mr. Deloitte. But you've seen it before. The woman on the phone said it had been observed at high-latitude coastal stations. Plural. Other stations have reported anomalous environmental patterns. Whether those patterns are the same phenomenon as what you've described, or related, or coincidental, is not something we've been able to determine. The weather signature. She said the thermal correlation was new. New, as in I'm the first to notice it, or new as in it hasn't happened before. New, as in you're the first to document it in a way that's analytically useful, which is why we're offering the enhanced termination. Your records are significantly more detailed than previous operators. Previous operators, I said. How many? Patel removed her glasses and polished them on her sleeve, which I recognized as a gesture of decision, someone choosing how much to say. Kovach Point has had consistent staffing for 9 years. You are the 12th operator to serve a rotation there. 3 others filed reports referencing anomalous prints in the snow. None of them provided camera footage, weather correlations, or GPS coordinate mapping. 12 operators in 9 years. 3 reports before mine. The other 8 either didn't see anything or didn't say anything, and I had no way to know which. What happened to Tomaszewski? I asked. He completed his rotation and returned to his home in Gdansk. To our knowledge, he's fine. Did he request extraction? The silence answered. Aronson looked at the table. Patel put her glasses back on. He completed his rotation, she said again. Carefully, as if the words meant exactly what they said and nothing more, and I could take them or leave them. I signed the termination agreement. I took the money. I don't know what else I was supposed to do. Take them to court, tell the press. Tell them what? That invisible boots walk in logarithmic spirals around an Arctic research station and displace thermal energy while doing it. I'd sound like the kind of person who sees UFOs and weather balloons. And Meridian knew that, which is why the enhanced payout wasn't hush money. It was a bet that I'd hush myself. That was 3 months ago. I'm back in Marquette now, staying in Sarah's spare bedroom, working part-time at a marine supply store while I figure out what comes next. She doesn't ask about Kovach Point anymore. She asked once, the first week I was back, and I told her enough to make her stop asking, which wasn't much. Here's what I think about. I think about the termination point. That 12-foot cluster 1.3 miles west of the station where every walk ended. I plotted it on a satellite map after I got back. There's nothing there. Flat tundra. No feature, no structure, no geological anomaly visible from orbit. Just a spot on the coastal plain where something invisible has been walking to, over and over, from every direction, for at least as long as the station has existed, maybe longer. I think about the fuel math. The 1,140 gallons and the 58 degrees. I've run the calculation 4 more times since I got home, using the heating logs and the weather data, and the thermal gain records from the footprint events. When I subtract the anomalous heat input from the total, the fuel consumption balances perfectly. The diesel accounts for exactly the warmth it should. The extra degrees came from outside the system. Something was heating my building as a byproduct of walking past it, the way a person's body heat warms a room just by being in it. Except this warmth came from displaced atmospheric energy, not a body, or maybe from a body I couldn't see. I think about the barometric pressure which never changed during any of the events. Temperature dropped, wind stopped, but the air pressure stayed constant. Whatever was displacing heat wasn't displacing mass. It had thermodynamic presence but no physical volume. I don't know what that means. I don't think Dr. Patel knows either, though I suspect she has theories she doesn't share with facilities operators. I think about something Thomas Yuski wrote on the last page of his notebook, the only entry that wasn't a data log. It was dated December 12th, the day he left, and it said, "The walks are not approach. The walks are routine. We are not the destination. We are on the way." Reading it in Marquette, 3,000 miles from Kovach Point, the words confirmed what I'd felt in the hours after the wall scene, sitting at the operations desk watching the camera feeds cycle. If he's right, then nothing was converging on the station. The station was built in the path of something that was already walking, something that has always been walking, and the convergence I measured was just the pattern adjusting to an obstacle. The way water routes around a stone. I haven't worked a remote posting since Kovach Point. Meridian hasn't called, and I haven't answered the phone when other companies have. The marine supply store is warm and well lit, and the most anomalous thing that happens there is someone returning a depth finder they've clearly dropped in a lake. But last Tuesday I was stocking shelves and I heard it. A soft compression against the floor near the back wall of the stockroom. Then another. Rhythmic. Measured. 28 inches apart, if I had to guess, though I didn't measure. Not this time. The building's thermostat read 74 degrees. It was set to 68. The heat wasn't running. I put down the box I was carrying and stood very still and listened to the footsteps walk the length of the stockroom wall and fade to nothing. 6 degrees. The same differential, the same sound. 3,000 miles from Kovach Point, in a marine supply store in Marquette, Michigan. And whatever it was had followed me home or had always been here, and I'd only learned to hear it because of 22 days on the Beaufort seacoast. I haven't told Sarah. I don't know what I'd tell her. I check the thermostat every morning now, and every morning it reads between 2 and 6 degrees above the set point, and the heat isn't running, and the floor near the back wall is warm in one spot when I press my palm against it. I keep good records. I always have. I'm logging the temperature differentials in a notebook I keep in my truck, and I will not be sending them to Meridian Polar Services. But the numbers don't balance. They haven't balanced since February 9th, and I'm starting to think they never did, and I just didn't notice until someone taught me to listen for the sound that the imbalance makes when it walks past your wall.